America, Disc 7.
Sandy's behavior so unsettled me that, in the evenings, I took to doing my homework out of sight of him at the kitchen table. That was how I came to overhear my father, who was in the living room with my mother, reading the evening paper there while Sandy remained in contemptuous seclusion at the back of the flat, reminding her that our private turmoil was exactly the sort of dissension that the Lindbergh anti-Semites had hoped to stir up between Jewish parents and their children with programs like Just Folks. Understanding this, however, had only hardened his resolve not to pick up and leave like Shepsy Tershwell. "What are you talking about?" said my mother. "Are you telling me that the Tershwells are going to Canada?" "In June, yes," he replied. "Why? Why June? What's happening in June?" "When did you find out? Why didn't you say something?" "Because I knew it would upset you." "And it has. Why shouldn't it?" "Why?" she demanded to know. "Why, Herman, are they leaving in June?" "Because, in Shepsy's judgment, the time has come." "Let's not discuss it," my father said softly. "The little one is in the kitchen, and he's frightened enough. If Shepsy feels it's time, that is his decision for himself and his family, and good luck to him. Shepsy sits and watches the latest news hour after hour. The news is Shepsy's life, and the news is terrible, and so it affects how he thinks, and this is the decision he came up with." "The man came up with the decision," my mother said, "because he is informed." "I am also informed," he said sharply. "I am no less informed. I have just reached a different conclusion." "Don't you understand that these anti-Semitic bastards want us to run away? They want to get the Jews so fed up with everything," he told her, "that they leave for good, and then the Goyim will have this wonderful country all to themselves. Well, I have a better idea. Why don't they leave? A whole bunch of them. Why don't they all go live under their Fuhrer in Nazi Germany? Then we will have a wonderful country. Look, Shepsy can do whatever he thinks is right, but we aren't going anywhere. There is still a Supreme Court in this country. Thanks to Franklin Roosevelt, it's a liberal Supreme Court, and it is there to look after our rights. There's Justice Douglas, there is Justice Frankfurter, there is Justice Murphy and Justice Black. They are there to uphold the law. There are still good men in this country. There is Roosevelt, there is Ickes, there is Mayor LaGuardia. In November, there is a congressional election. There is still the ballot box, and people can still vote without anybody telling them what to do." "And what will they vote for?" my mother asked, and immediately answered herself. "The American people will vote," she said, "and the Republicans will be even stronger. Quiet. Try to keep your voice down, will you? When November comes," he told her, "we'll find out the results, and there'll be time then to decide what to do." "And if there isn't time, there will be. Please, Bess," he said. "This cannot go on every night." And his was the last word. That was probably only because of me doing my homework in the kitchen that my mother forced herself to say no more. The next day, right after school, I walked down Chancellor Avenue and around to Clinton Place, and then beyond the high school, to where I figured chances were slight that anybody would recognize me, and waited there for a bus downtown to the Newsreel Theater. I checked the newspaper timetable the night before. There was an hour-long show beginning at 5 minutes to 4, which meant that I could catch a 5 o'clock number 14 at the Broad Street stop across from the theater and be safely back in time for dinner, or even earlier, depending on when von Ribbentrop was slotted into the program. One way or another, I had to see Aunt Evelyn at the White House, and not because, like my parents, I was appalled and outraged by what she was doing, but because her having gone there at all seemed to me more remarkable than anything that could possibly befall a member of our family, except for what had befallen Alvin. Nazi bigwig, White House guest. That was the black-lettered headline, spelled out across either side of the theater's triangular marquee. And along with my being downtown without my brother or Earl Axman or one of my parents, it made me feel powerfully delinquent when I stepped up to the box office window and asked for a ticket. "Unaccompanied by an adult?" "No, sir," the woman selling tickets told me. "I'm an orphan," I told her. "I live at the orphanage on Lyons Avenue. The sister sent me to do a report on President Lindbergh. Where's her note?" I'd carefully written one out on the bus, using a blank page from my notebook, and handed it through the money slot. It was modeled after the notes of permission my mother wrote for school trips, only it was signed, Sister Mary Catherine, St. Peter's Orphanage. The woman looked at it without reading it, then beckoned for me to push my money over. I gave her one of Alvin's 10s, a huge bill for a kid my size, let alone an orphan from St. Peter's, but she was busy and gave back $9.50 and change and slipped me a ticket without any fuss. She failed, however, to return the note. "I need that," I said. "Let's go, Sonny," she said impatiently, and motioned for me to make room for the people still lining up for the next show. I got inside just as the lights went out, and the martial music came on and the film began to roll. Because seemingly every man in Newark, the theater drew only a very few women, wanted to get a look at the unlikely White House guest. The place was filled to capacity for this late Friday afternoon show, and the only empty seat I could find was in the far reaches of the balcony. Anyone entering now would have to stand at the back of the orchestra's last row. A great excitement came over me, not only because of my having pulled off something that was not expected of me, but because, enveloped by the fumes of the hundreds of cigarettes and the extravagant odor of the 5-cent cigars, I felt deep in the virile magic of a boy masquerading as a man among men. British land on Madagascar to take over French naval base. Pierre Laval, chief of Vichy French government, denounces British move as act of aggression. RAF bombs Stuttgart third consecutive night. British fighter planes in savage air battle over Malta. German army resumes assault on USSR in the Kerch Peninsula. Mandalay falls to Japanese army in Burma. Japanese army launches new drive in jungles of New Guinea. Japanese army marches into Yunnan province of China from Burma. Chinese guerrillas raid city of Canton, killing 500 Japanese troops. A multitude of helmets, uniforms, weapons, buildings, harbors, beaches, flora, fauna, human faces of every race, but otherwise the same inferno again and again. The unsurpassable evil from whose horrors the United States, of all the great nations, is alone in being spared. Picture after picture of misery without end, the mortars bursting, the infantrymen doubled over and running, Marines with raised rifles wading ashore, airplanes dropping bombs, airplanes blown apart and spiraling to earth, the mass graves, the kneeling chaplains, the improvised crosses, the sinking ships, the drowning sailors, the sea in flames, the shattered bridges, the tank bombardment, the targeted hospital sheared in two, pillars of fire coiling upward from bombed-out oil tanks, prisoners corralled in a sea of mud, stretchers bearing living torsos, bayoneted civilians, dead babies, beheaded bodies, bubbling blood. And then the White House. A twilit spring evening. Shadows falling across the sprawl of lawn, blooming bushes, flowering trees, limousines driven by liveried chauffeurs and everyone exiting them in formal attire. From the marble hallway beyond the open portico doors, a string ensemble playing last year's #1 hit song, Intermezzo, popularized from a theme in Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. Gracious smiles, quiet laughter, the lean, beloved, handsome president. Beside him, the talented poetess, daring aviatrix, and decorous socialite who is the mother of their murdered child. The loquacious, silver-haired, honored guest. The elegant Nazi spouse in her long satin gown, welcoming words, witticisms, and the old-world gallant, steeped in the theatrics of the royal court and looking in his evening clothes like $1,000,000, charmingly kissing the First Lady's hand. Had it not been for the Iron Cross awarded to the foreign minister by his Führer, and embellishing the pocket just inches below the impeccably arranged silk handkerchief, as persuasively civilized a sham as human cunning could devise. And there, Aunt Evelyn, Rabbi Bengelsdorf, past the Marine Guards, through the doorway, and gone. They couldn't have been on the screen for as long as 3 seconds, and yet the rest of the national news and the closing sports clips were incomprehensible to me, and I kept hoping for the film to spin back to the moment where my aunt materialized a sparkle with the gems, previously the property of the rabbi's late wife. Among the many improbabilities that the cameras established as irrefutably real, Aunt Evelyn's disgraceful triumph was for me the least real of all. When the show was over and the lights went up, A uniformed usher was standing in the aisle, motioning with his flashlight. "You," he said, "you come with me." He led me into the crowd that was emptying out of the lobby, and through a door he unlocked with a key, and then up a narrow stairway that I recognized from when Sandy and I had been brought here to see the Madison Square Garden von Ribbentrop rallies. "How old are you?" the usher asked me. 16. "Oh, that's a good one. Keep it up, kid. Get yourself in more hot water." "I have to go home now," I told him. "I'm going to miss my bus." "You're going to miss a lot more than that." He rapped sharply on the famous soundproof door to the newsreel's projection booth, and Mr. Tershwell let us in. He was holding the note from Sister Mary Catherine. "I don't see how I cannot show this to your parents," he told me. "It was just a joke," I said. "Your father's coming to pick you up. I telephoned his office to tell him you were here." "Thank you," I said as politely as I had been taught to say it. "Please, sit down." "But it was a joke," I repeated. Mr. Tershwell was preparing the reels for the news show. I saw when I got to looking around that many of the signed photos of the theater's renowned patrons had been removed from the walls, and realized that Mr. Tershwell had begun to gather together the mementos he was taking to Winnipeg. And I realized, too, that the gravity of such a move might alone have been enough to account for the sternness with which he was treating me. Yet he also struck me as the exacting sort of adult whose sense of responsibility often extends to what is none of his business. It would have been hard to tell from either his looks or his speech that he'd grown up in a Newark tenement with my father. He was an understated, distinctly more polished and prideful version than my father, of the scantily educated slum child who'd lifted himself out of his parents' immigrant poverty almost entirely by virtue of a vigilant, programmatic industriousness. Order, for these men, was all they had to go on. What their Gentile betters call pushiness was generally just this, the ardor that was everything. "If I go outside," I said, "I can still get the bus and be home in time for dinner." "Stay where you are, please." "But what did I do wrong? I wanted to see my aunt." "This isn't fair," I said, dangerously close to crying. "I wanted to see my aunt at the White House, that's all." "Your aunt," he said, and he gritted his teeth so as to say no more. Of all things, his disdain for Aunt Evelyn triggered my tears. Here, Mr. Tershwell lost his patience. "Are you suffering?" he asked sardonically. "What? What are you suffering?" "Do you have any idea what people are going through all over the world? Do you understand nothing of what you just saw? I only hope that in the future you are spared any real reason to cry. I hope and pray that in the days ahead your family—" He stopped abruptly, clearly unaccustomed to an undignified eruption of irrational emotion, particularly in the handling of an insignificant child. Even I could understand that his argument was with something other than me, but that didn't lessen the shock of my having to bear the brunt of it. "What's going to happen in June?" I asked him. It was the unanswered question that I had overheard my mother ask my father the night before. Mr. Tershwell continued scanning my face as though trying to determine how lacking in intelligence I was. "Pull yourself together," he finally said. "Here," and handed me his handkerchief. "Dry your eyes." I did as he told me, but when I repeated, "What's going to happen? Why are you going to Canada?" the exasperation all at once disappeared from his voice, and something emerged both stronger and milder. His intelligence. "I have a new job there," he replied. That he was sparing me terrified me, and I was again in tears. My father arrived some 20 minutes later. Mr. Tershwell handed him the note I'd written to get myself into the theater, but my father didn't take the time to read it until he had steered me by the elbow out of the theater and into the street. That's when he hit me. First, my mother hits my brother. Now, my father reads the words of Sister Mary Catherine and, for the first time ever, wallops me, without restraint, across the face. As I am already overwrought, and nothing like as stoical as Sandy, I break down uncontrollably alongside the ticket booth. In plain view of all the Gentiles hurrying home from their downtown offices for a carefree spring weekend in Lindbergh's peacetime America, the autonomous fortress oceans away from the world's war zones, where no one is in jeopardy, except us. Chapter 6. May 1942 to June 1942. Their Country. May 22nd, 1942. Dear Mr. Roth, in compliance with a request from Homestead 42, Office of American Absorption, U.S. Department of the Interior, our company is offering relocation opportunities to senior employees like yourself, deemed qualified for inclusion in the OAA's bold new nationwide initiative. It was exactly 80 years ago that the U.S. Congress passed the Homestead Act of 1862, the famous legislation unique to America, which granted 160 acres of unoccupied public land virtually free to farmers willing to pull up stakes and settle the new American West. Nothing comparable has been undertaken since then to provide adventurous Americans with exciting new opportunities to expand their horizons and to strengthen their country. Metropolitan Life is proud to be among the very first group of major American corporations and financial institutions selected to be participants in the new Homestead program, which is designed to give emerging American families a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to move their households at government expense in order to strike roots in an inspiring region of America previously inaccessible to them. Homestead 42 will provide a challenging environment steeped in our country's oldest traditions where parents and children can enrich their Americanness over the generations. Upon receipt of this announcement, you should immediately contact Mr. Wilfred Kurth, the Homestead 42 representative in our Madison Avenue office. He will personally answer all your questions, and his staff will courteously assist you in every way they can. Congratulations to you and your family for having been chosen from among numerous deserving candidates at Metropolitan Life to be among the company's first pioneering homesteaders of 1942. Sincerely yours, Homer L. Casson, Vice President for Employee Affairs. Several days had to pass before my father could summon the composure to show the company's letter to my mother and to break the news that as of September 1st, 1942, he was being transferred from the Metropolitan's Newark district to a district office opening in Danville, Kentucky. On a map of Kentucky that had been included in the Homestead 42 packet presented to him by Mr. Kurth, he located Danville for us. Then he read aloud from a page in a Chamber of Commerce pamphlet entitled The Bluegrass State. Danville is the county seat of rural Boyle County. It sits in beautiful Kentucky countryside about 60 miles south of Lexington, the state's second biggest city after Louisville. He began flipping through the pamphlet to find still more interesting facts to read aloud that would somehow mitigate the senselessness of this turn of events. Daniel Boone helped to blaze the Wilderness Road, which opened the way to the settlement of Kentucky. In 1792, Kentucky became the first state west of the Appalachians to join the Union. The population of Kentucky in 1940 was 2,845,627. The population of Danville, let me get it here, Danville's population was 6,700. And how many Jews in Danville, my mother asked? Of the 6,700, how many in the whole state? You already know best. There are very few. All I can tell you is that it could be worse. Could be Montana, where the Gellers are going. Could be Kansas, where the Schwartzes are going. It could be Oklahoma, where the Brodys are going. 7 men are leaving from our office, and I am the luckiest, believe me. Kentucky is a beautiful place with a beautiful climate. It is not the end of the world. We will wind up living out there just about the way we live here. Maybe better, given that everything is cheaper and the climate's so nice. There's going to be school for the boys. There's going to be the job for me. There's going to be the house for you. Chances are we'll be able to afford to buy a place of our own where the boys can each have a separate room and a yard out back to play in. And just where do they get the gall to do this to people, my mother asked. I am dumbfounded, Herman. Our families are here. Our lifelong friends are here. The children's friends are here. We have lived in peace and harmony here all of our lives. We are only a block from the best elementary school in Newark. We are a block from the best high school in New Jersey. Our boys have been raised among Jews. They go to school with other Jewish children. There is no friction with the other children. There is no name-calling. There are no fights. They have never had to feel left out and lonely the way I did as a child. I cannot believe the company is doing this to you. The way you have worked for those people, the hours that you put in, the effort, and this," she said angrily, "is the reward?" "Boys," my father said, "ask me what you want to know. Mother is right. This is a big surprise for all of us. We are all a little dumbfounded, so ask whatever is on your mind. I don't want anybody to be confused about anything." But Sandy wasn't confused, nor did he look dumbfounded in any way. Sandy was thrilled, and barely able to hide his glee, and all because he knew exactly where to find Danville, Kentucky on the map. 14 miles from the Mowiney's tobacco farm. It could have been that he also known we would be moving there long before any of the rest of us did. My father and mother may not have said as much, but then, precisely because of what no one was saying, even I could understand that my father's being selected as one of his district's 7 Jewish homesteaders was no more fortuitous than his assignment to the company's new Danville office. Once he'd opened the back door to our flat and told Aunt Evelyn to leave the house and never come back, our fate could have played out no other way. It was after dinner, and we were in the living room. Serenely unperturbed, Sandy was drawing something and had no questions to ask, and I, looking outside with my face pressed to the screen of the open window, I had no questions to ask either, and so my father, grimly absorbed in his thoughts, and knowing he'd been defeated, began to pace the floor, and my mother, on the sofa, murmured something under her breath, refusing to resign herself to what awaited us. In the drama of confrontation, in the struggle against we knew not what, each had taken on the role that the other had played in the lobby of the Washington Hotel. I realized how far things had gone and how terribly confusing everything now was, and how calamity, when it comes in a rush. Since about 3 it had been squalling steadily, but abruptly the wind-driven downpour stopped, and the sun came blazing out as though the clocks had been turned ahead, and, over in the west, tomorrow morning was now set to begin at 6 p.m. today. How could a street as modest as ours induce such rapture just because it glittered with rain? How could the sidewalks' impassable leaf-strewn lagoons and the grassy little yards oozing from the flood of the downspouts exude a smell that roused my delight as if I'd been born in a tropical rainforest? Tinged with a bright after-storm light, Summit Avenue was as agleam with life as a pet, my own silky, pulsating pet, washed clean by sheets of falling water, and now stretched its full length to bask in the bliss. Nothing would ever get me to leave here. "And who will the boys play with?" my mother asked. "There are plenty of children in Kentucky to play with," he assured her. "And who will I talk to?" she asked. "Who will I have there like the friends I've had my whole life? There are women there, too. Gentile women," she said. Ordinarily, my mother drew no strength from scorn, but she spoke scornfully now. That's how perplexed she was and how endangered she felt. "Good Christian women," she said, "who will fall all over themselves to make me feel at home." "They have no right to do this," she proclaimed. "Bess, please. This is what it is like to work for a big company. Big companies transfer people all the time, and when they do, you have to pick up and go. I'm talking about the government. The government cannot do this. They cannot force people to pick up and go. That is not in any constitution that I ever heard of." "They aren't forcing us. Then why are we going?" she asked. "Of course they are forcing us. This is illegal. You cannot just take Jews because they're Jews and force them to live where you want them to. You cannot take a city and just do what you want with it. To get rid of Newark as it is, with Jews living here like everyone else? What business is it of theirs? This is against the law. Everyone knows it is against the law." "Yes," said Sandy, without bothering to look up from what he was sketching. "Why don't we sue the United States of America?" "You can sue," I told him, "in the Supreme Court." "Ignore him," my mother told me. "Until your brother learns to be civil, we just continue to ignore him." Here, Sandy got up and took his drawing materials into our bedroom, and I, unable any longer to witness the spectacle of my father's defenselessness and my mother's anguish, unlocked the front door and raced down the front stairs and out into the street where the kids who'd finished their dinner were already dropping popsicle sticks into the gutters and watching them cascade over the iron grate into the gurgling sewer, along with the natural detritus shaken by the storm from the locust trees, and the swirl of candy wrappers, beetles, bottle caps, earthworms, cigarette butts, and, mysteriously, inexplicably, predictably, the single mucilaginous rubber. Everybody was out having one last good time before they had to turn in for bed, and all of them still capable of having a good time because none had a parent working for any of the corporations collaborating with Homestead 42. Their fathers were men who worked for themselves, or with a partner who was a brother or an in-law, and so they weren't going to have to go anywhere. But I wasn't going anywhere either. I would not be driven by the United States government from a street whose very gutters gushed with the elixir of life. Alvin was in the rackets in Philadelphia. Sandy lived in exile in our house, and my father's authority as a protector had been drastically compromised, if not destroyed. 2 years earlier, to preserve our chosen way of life, he had mustered his strength to drive over to the Home Office and, face-to-face with the big boss, to decline the promotion that would have advanced his career and increased his earnings, but at the price of taking us to live in heavily Bundes, New Jersey. Now, he no longer had it in him to challenge an uprooting, potentially no less hazardous, having concluded that confrontation was futile and our fate out of his hands. Shockingly enough, my father had been rendered impotent by his companies having obediently joined hands with the state. There was nobody left to protect us, except me. After school the next day, I covertly headed off again for the downtown bus, this time for the number 7 line, whose route ran some 3/4 of a mile from Summit Avenue, on the far side of the farmed acreage of the orphan asylum, out where St. Peter's Church fronted the thoroughfare of Lyons Avenue, and where, in the shadow of its cross-capped steeple, I was even less likely to be spotted by a neighbor or a schoolmate or a family friend than when I made it my business to walk past the high school and down to Clinton Place to take the number 14. I waited at the bus stop outside the church beside 2 nuns identically buried within the coarse heavy cloth of those voluminous black habits that I'd never had a chance to study as I did that day. Back then, a nun's habit reached to her shoes, and that, along with the brilliant white starched arc of cloth that starkly framed her facial features and obliterated all lateral vision, the stiffened wimple that hid scalp, ears, chin, and neck, and was itself enfolded in an extensive white headcloth, made of the traditionally dressed Catholic nuns the most archaic-looking creatures I had ever seen, far more startling to behold in our neighborhood than even the creepily mortician-like priests. No buttons or pockets were visible, and thus there was no way to figure out how that sheath of thickly gathered prophylactic curtaining got hooked up or how it was taken off, or whether it was ever taken off, given that overlaying everything was a large metal cross suspended from a long cord necklace and strung beads big and shiny as killer marbles that dangled several feet down from the front of a black leather belt, and, secured to the headcloth, a black veil that broadened at the back and fell straight to the waist. Other than within the naked little region that was the wimpled, plain, unornamented face, no nap, no softness, no fuzziness anywhere. I assumed these were 2 of the nuns who supervised the lives of the orphans and taught in the parochial school. Neither looked my way, and, on my own, without a wisecracking sidekick like Earl Axman, I didn't dare to look at them, other than in stolen glances, though even while I stared at my own 2 feet, the clever child's capacity for self-censorship deserted me, and I confronted the mysteries again and again, all the questions concerning their female bodies and its lowliest functions, and all tending toward depravity. Despite the seriousness of the afternoon secret mission and everything that rode on its outcome, I couldn't manage to be anywhere near a nun, let alone a pair of them, without a mind awash in my none too pure Jewish thoughts. The nuns took the 2 seats behind the driver, and though most of the seats farther to the rear were empty, I sat down across the narrow aisle from the 2 of them, in the seat just back from the turnstile and the fare box. I'd had no intention of sitting there, didn't understand why I was doing so, but instead of moving off to where I could be out from under the sway of unfettered curiosity, I opened my notebook to pretend to do my homework, simultaneously hoping and dreading that I'd overhear them say something in Catholic. Alas, they were silent. Praying, I supposed, and no less spellbinding for doing it on a bus. Some 5 minutes from downtown, there was a musical clacking of rosary beads as together they rose to disembark at the wide intersection of High Street and Clinton Avenue. On one side of the junction, there was an auto dealer's lot, and on the other, the Hotel Riviera. As they passed, the taller of the nuns smiled down at me from the island, and with a vague sadness in her quiet voice, perhaps because the Messiah had come and gone without my knowing it, commented to her companion, "What a well-scrubbed, cute little boy." She should have known what I'd been thinking. Then again, maybe she did. A few minutes later, before the bus took the big final turn off Broad Street and started down Raymond Boulevard for its last stop outside Penn Station, I too got off and began running toward the Federal Office Building on Washington Street, where Aunt Evelyn had her office. Inside the lobby, I was told by an elevator operator that the OAA was on the top floor, and when I got there, I asked for Evelyn Finkel. "You're Sandy's brother," the receptionist announced. "You could be his little twin," she added appreciatively. "Sandy's 5 years older," I told her. "Sandy's a wonderful, wonderful boy," she said. Everybody loved having him around. And then she buzzed Aunt Evelyn's office. "Nephew Philip's here, Miss F.," she announced. And within seconds, Aunt Evelyn had swept me past the desks of some half-dozen men and women working at their typewriters and into her office, overlooking the public library and the Newark Museum. She was kissing me and hugging me and telling me how much she had missed me, and despite all my apprehensions, beginning, of course, with the fear that my meeting with our estranged aunt would be discovered by my parents, I proceeded as I had planned, by confiding in Aunt Evelyn how I had secretly gone along to the Newsreel Theater to see her at the White House. I sat in the chair at the side of her desk, a desk easily twice the size of my father's just over on Clinton Street, and asked her to tell me what it had been like to eat dinner with the President and Mrs. Lindbergh. When she began to answer in elaborate detail, and with an eagerness to impress that didn't quite make sense to a mere child already overwhelmed by the magnitude of her betrayal, I couldn't believe I was so easily tricking her into thinking that this was why I was here. There were 2 big maps pierced with clumps of colored pins and fixed to an enormous cork bulletin board on the wall back of her desk. The larger map was of the 48 states and the smaller of just New Jersey, whose long inland river boundary with neighboring Pennsylvania we had been taught in school to identify as the uncanny outline of an Indian chief's profile, the brow up by Phillipsburg, the nostrils down by Stockton, and the chin narrowing into the neck in the vicinity of Trenton. The state's densely populated easternmost corner, encompassing Jersey City, Newark, Passaic, and Paterson, and extending northward to the ruleless straight border with the southernmost counties of the state of New York, denoted the upper back end of the Indian's feathered headdress. That was how I saw it then, and how I continue to see it. Along with the 5 senses, a child of my background had a 6th sense in those days, the geographic sense, the sharp sense of where he lived and who and what surrounded him. On Aunt Evelyn's spacious desktop, alongside separately framed pictures of my dead grandmother and of Rabbi Bengelsdorf, there was a large autographed photo of President and Mrs. Lindbergh standing together in the Oval Office and a smaller photo of Aunt Evelyn in her evening gown, shaking the president's hand. "That's the reception line," she explained. On the way into the state dining room, the guests each file past the president and the first lady and the evening's honored guest. You're introduced by name, and they take a photograph, and the White House sends it to you. Did the president say anything? He said, "Nice to have you here." "Are you allowed to say anything back?" I asked. I said, "I'm honored, Mr. President." She made no effort to disguise how important that exchange had been to her, and perhaps to the President of the United States. As always with Aunt Evelyn, there was something very winning about her enthusiasm, though in the context of my household's confusion, I couldn't miss what was diabolical about it as well. Never in my life had I so harshly judged any adult, not my parents, not even Alvin or Uncle Monty, nor had I understood till then how the shameless vanity of utter fools can so strongly determine the fate of others. "Did you meet Mr. von Ribbentrop?" Now, almost girlishly bashful, she replied, "I danced with Mr. von Ribbentrop." "Where?" "There was dancing after dinner in a big tent on the White House lawn. It was a beautiful night. An orchestra and dancing, and Lionel and I were introduced to the foreign minister and his wife, and we got to talking, and then he just bowed and asked me to dance. He's known to be an excellent dancer, and he is, it's true, a perfectly magical ballroom dancer. And his English is faultless. He studied at the University of London, and then lived for 4 years as a young man in Canada. His great youthful adventure, he calls it. I found him a very charming gentleman and highly intelligent." "What did he say?" I asked. "Oh, we talked about the president, about the OAA, about our lives. We talked about everything. He plays the violin, you know. He's like Lionel, a man of the world who can talk knowledgeably about anything. Here, look, darling. Look at what I was wearing. Do you see the bag I was carrying? It's gold mesh. See this? See the scarabs? Gold, enamel, and turquoise scarabs. What's a scarab? It's a beetle. It's a gem that's cut to resemble a beetle. And it was made right here in Newark by the family of the first Mrs. Bengelsdorf. Their workshop was world famous. They made jewelry for the kings and queens of Europe and all of the wealthiest people in America. Look at my engagement ring," she said, placing her perfumed little hand so close to my face, I felt like a dog suddenly and wanted to lick it. "See the stone? That is an emerald, my dearest, dear child." "A real one?" She kissed me. "A real one. And in the photo, here, that's a link bracelet. It's gold with sapphires and pearls, real ones," she said, kissing me again. "The foreign minister said he'd never seen a bracelet more beautiful anywhere. And what do you think that is around my neck? A necklace? A festoon necklace." "What's festoon?" "A chain of flowers, a garland of flowers. You know the word festival? You know festivities? And you know feast, too, don't you? Well, they're all related. And look, the 2 brooches, see them? They're sapphires, darling. Montana sapphires set in gold. And do you see who is wearing them? Who? Who is that? It's Aunt Evelyn. It's Evelyn Finkel of Dewey Street, at the White House. Isn't it unbelievable?" "I guess so," I said. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, drawing me to her and kissing me now all over my face. "I guess so, too. I'm so glad you came to see me. I've missed you so." And she stroked me then, as if to find out if my pockets were stuffed with stolen goods. Only years later did I come to understand that her skillful way with her groping hands may well have been what accounted for the rapid renovation of Aunt Evelyn's life by a figure of the stature of Lionel Bengelsdorf. Brilliant and erudite though the rabbi was, superior to everyone even in his egoism, Aunt Evelyn must never have been at a loss with him. The paradise of envelopment that followed was, of course, unidentifiable at the time. Wherever I put my own two hands, there was the soft surface of her body. Wherever I moved my face, there was the thickness of her scent. Wherever I looked, there was her clothing, new spring wrappings so light and gauzy that they didn't even veil the sheen of her slip. And there were the eyes of another human being as I'd never quite seen them before. I had not reached the age of desire, was blinded, of course, by the word "and," still found the random little stiffening of my acorn of a penis the puzzling nuisance it had always been, and so the delight that I took nestling into the curvaceousness of my mother's 31-year-old sister, a tiny, lively Thumbelina seemingly timid in no way and formed after the model of hills and apples, was a lifeless feeling of frenzy and nothing more, as though a rare, imperfectly printed treasure of a stamp that I knew to be priceless had accidentally turned up on an ordinary letter dropped by the postman into our Summit Avenue mailbox. Aunt Evelyn, my darling, do you know we're moving to Kentucky? Uh-huh. I don't want to go, Aunt Evelyn. I want to stay at my school. She stepped back sharply from me, and with the air now of anything but a paramour, asked, "Who sent you here, Philip?" "Sent me? Nobody." "Who sent you to see me? Tell the truth." "It is the truth. Nobody." She returned to the chair behind the desk, and the look in her eyes made it necessary for me to do everything I could not to get up and run. But I wanted what I wanted too much to run. "There's nothing to be afraid of in Kentucky," she said. "I'm not afraid. I just don't want to have to move." Even her silence was all-embracing, and, if I had indeed been lying, would have forced from me the confession she wanted. Her life, poor woman, was a perpetual state of intensity. "Can't Selden and his mother go instead of us?" I asked. "Who is Selden?" "The boy downstairs whose father died. His mother works for the Metropolitan now. How come we have to go and they don't?" "Wasn't it your father who put you up to this, dear?" No. Nobody even knows I'm here." But I saw she still didn't believe me. Her aversion to my father was too precious to be dislodged by the obvious truth. "Does Selden want to go with you to Kentucky?" she asked me. "I didn't ask him. I don't know. I just thought I'd ask you if they could go instead." "My dear little boy, do you see the New Jersey map? Do you see these pins in the map? Each one represents a family chosen for relocation. Now, look at the map of the whole country. See all the pins there? Those represent the location to which each New Jersey family has been assigned. Making these assignments involves the cooperation of many, many people in this office, in the Washington headquarters, and in the state to which each family is moving. The biggest and most important corporations in New Jersey are relocating employees in a partnership with Homestead 42. And so much more planning, much, much more than you can begin to imagine, has gone into all of this. And of course, no decision is made by any one person. But even if it was, and I were that person, and I could do something to keep you near your friends in your school, I would continue to think that you, for one, are going to benefit enormously by becoming something more than another Jewish child whose parents have made him too frightened ever to leave the ghetto. Look what your family has done to Sandy. You saw your brother in New Brunswick that night. You saw him talking to all those people about his adventure on the tobacco farm. Do you remember that night, she asked me? Weren't you proud of him? Yes. And did it sound as though living in Kentucky was frightening, and that Sandy was ever for a moment afraid? No. Here, having reached into her desk for something, she got up and came around again to where I was sitting. Her pretty face, with its large features and thickly applied makeup, suddenly looked to me preposterous, the carnal face of the ravenous mania to which, in my mother's judgment, her emotional younger sister had helplessly fallen prey. To be sure, for a child in the court of Louis XIV, the ambitions and satisfactions of such a relative would never have attained the same intimidating aura of significance that Aunt Evelyn's did for me. Nor would the worldly advancement of a cleric like Rabbi Bengelsdorf had seemed the least bit scandalous to my parents, were they themselves raised at court as a marquis and a marchioness. Probably I couldn't have done any worse. I might well have done a lot better seeking solace from the two nuns on the Lyons Avenue bus than from someone reveling in the pleasures of the standard, petty corruptions that proliferate wherever people compete for even the tiniest advantages of rank. Be brave, darling. Be a brave boy. Do you want to sit on the front stoop of Summit Avenue for the rest of your life? Or do you want to go out into the world like Sandy did and prove that you are as good as anyone? Suppose I'd been afraid to go to the White House and meet the president because people like your father say things about him and call him names. Suppose I'd been afraid to meet the foreign minister because they call him names. You cannot go around being afraid of everything that isn't familiar to you. You cannot grow up to be frightened like your parents. Promise me you won't. I promise. Here, she said, I have a treat for you. And she handed me one of two little cardboard packets that she had been holding in her hand. I got this for you at the White House. I love you, sweetheart, and I want you to have it. What is it? An after-dinner chocolate. It's a chocolate wrapped in gold paper, and you know what's embossed right on the chocolate? The presidential seal. Here's one for you, and if I give you Sandy's, will you bring it to him for me? Okay. This is what's on your table at the White House at the end of the meal. Chocolates in a silver dish. And the moment I saw them there, I thought of the two boys in the world I most want to make happy. I got up, clutching the chocolates in my hand, and Aunt Evelyn put her arm tightly around my shoulder and walked me out past all the people working for her and into the corridor, where she pressed the button for the elevator. What is Selden's last name? She asked me. Wishnow. And he's your best friend? How could I explain that I couldn't bear him? And so at last I lied and said, yes, he is. And since my aunt did indeed love me, and was not herself lying when she said she wanted to make me happy, only a few days later, after I'd finally disposed of the White House chocolates by waiting until no one was around and throwing them over the orphanage fence, Mrs. Wishnow received a letter from the Metropolitan informing her that she and her family were fortunate enough to have been chosen to move to Kentucky as well. On a Sunday afternoon at the end of May, a confidential meeting was convened in our living room for the Jewish insurance agents who, along with my father, were being relocated from the Metropolitan's Newark office under the auspices of Homestead 42. They all came with just their wives, having agreed that it would be best to leave the children at home. Earlier in the afternoon, Sandy and I, joined by Selden Wishnow, had arranged the chairs for the meeting, including a set of bridge chairs we'd carried upstairs from the Wishnows. Afterward, Mrs. Wishnow drove the three of us to the Mayfair Theater in Hillside, where we would catch a double feature and then be picked up by my father when the meeting was over. The other guests were Shepsy and Estelle Tershwell, who were only days from moving their family to Winnipeg, and Monroe Silverman, a distant cousin who recently opened a law office in Irvington just above the haberdashery store owned by my father's second older brother, Lenny, the uncle who supplied Sandy and me with new school clothes at cost. When my mother suggested, out of her enduring respect for everything that one is taught to respect, that Hyman Resnick, our local rabbi, should be invited to attend the meeting, nobody else among the organizers who assembled in our kitchen the week before showed much enthusiasm for the idea, and after a deferential few minutes of discussion, during which my father said diplomatically what he always said diplomatically about Rabbi Resnick, I like the man, like his wife. No doubt in my mind he does an excellent job, but he's really not very brilliant, you know. My mother's proposal was tabled, even though, to the delight of a small child, these intimate friends of our family spoke in as wide and entertaining a range of voices as the characters on the Fred Allen Show, and were each as distinctively different-looking as the comic strip figures in the evening paper. This was back when evolution's sly wit was still rampantly apparent, long before the youthful renovation of face and figure became a serious adult aspiration. They were very similar people at the core. They raised their families, budgeted their money, attended to their elderly parents, and cared for their modest homes alike. On most every public issue, thought alike. In political elections, voted alike. Rabbi Resnick presided over an unimposing yellow brick synagogue at the edge of the neighborhood where everyone showed up in their high holiday best for the 3 days each year of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur observances, but otherwise returned there for little else, except, when necessary, to dutifully recite the daily prayer for the dead during the period prescribed. A rabbi was to officiate at weddings and funerals, to bar mitzvah their sons, to visit the ill in the hospital, and to console the bereft at the shiva. Beyond that, he did not play a role of any importance in their day-to-day lives, nor did any of them, including my respectful mother, expect him to. And not just because Resnick wasn't that brilliant. Their being Jews didn't issue from the rabbinate, or the synagogue, or from their few formal religious practices, though over the years, largely for the sake of living parents who came once a week to visit and eat, several of the households, ours among them, were kosher. Their being Jews didn't even issue from on high. To be sure, each Friday at sundown, when my mother ritually and touchingly with the devotional delicacy she absorbed as a child from watching her own mother, lit the Sabbath candles, she invoked the Almighty by his Hebrew title, but otherwise no one ever made mention of Adonai. These were Jews who needed no large terms of reference, no profession of faith or doctrinal creed in order to be Jews, and they certainly needed no other language. They had one, their native tongue, whose vernacular expressiveness they wielded effortlessly and, whether at the card table or while making a sales pitch, with the easygoing command of the indigenous population. Neither was their being Jews a mishap or a misfortune or an achievement to be proud of. What they were was what they couldn't get rid of, what they couldn't even begin to want to get rid of. Their being Jews issued from them being themselves, as did their being American. It was as it was, in the nature of things, as fundamental as having arteries and veins, and they never manifested the slightest desire to change it or deny it, regardless of the consequences. I'd known these people all my life. The women were close and reliable friends who exchanged confidences and swapped recipes, who commiserated with one another on the phone and looked after one another's children and regularly celebrated one another's birthdays by traveling the 12 miles to Manhattan to see a Broadway show. The men had not only worked for years in the same district office, but met to play pinochle. On the 2 evenings a month the women had their mahjong game, and from time to time on a Sunday morning, a group of them went off to the old sweat baths on Mercer Street with their young sons in tow. The offspring of this set happened all to be boys somewhere between Sandy's age and mine. On Decoration Day, the 4th of July and Labor Day, the families would usually organize a picnic some 10 miles west of our neighborhood at the bucolic South Mountain Reservation, where the fathers and the sons tossed horseshoes and chose up sides for softball and listened to a ball game on somebody's static-written portable radio, the most magical technology known to our world. The boys weren't necessarily the best of friends, but we felt connected through our father's affiliation. Of us all, Selden was the least robust, least confident, and, most painfully for him, least lucky, and yet it was to Selden that I had managed to contract myself for the remainder of boyhood and probably beyond. He'd begun to shadow me more doggedly since he and his mother had learned of their relocation, and I could only think that because we two were going to be the sole Jewish pupils in the Danville elementary school system, I'd be expected, by the Danville Gentiles no less than by our parents, to be his natural ally and closest companion. Selden's omnipresence might not be the worst that was awaiting me in Kentucky, but to the imagination of a 9-year-old it registered as an unendurable ordeal and accelerated the urge to rebel. How? I didn't know yet. All I'd felt so far was the pre-mutinous roiling, and all I'd done about it was to find a small, water-stained cardboard suitcase, forgotten beneath the usable luggage in our cellar storage bin, and, after cleaning it of mildew inside and out, hidden the clothing there that I surreptitiously took, piece by piece, from Selden's room whenever my mother dragooned me into enduring my hour downstairs as a peevish student of chess. I would have taken my own clothes to stow away in the suitcase, except that I knew my mother would discover what was missing, and one day soon I'd have to come up with an explanation. She still did the wash on the weekends and put the laundered clothes back, as well as the dry cleaning that it was my job to collect from the tailor shop on Saturdays. And so, mapped out in her head was an inventory of everyone's wardrobe that was complete down to the location of the last pair of socks. On the other hand, stealing clothes from Selden was a snap, and what with his having latched onto me as his other self, vengefully irresistible. Underclothes and socks were easy enough to get out of the Wishnow apartment and down the cellar stairs to the suitcase tucked beneath my undershirt. Stealing and hiding a pair of his trousers, a sport shirt, and a pair of his shoes posed a more difficult problem. But suffice it to say that Selden was distractible enough for the theft to be accomplished and for a time to go unnoticed. Once having gathered together everything of his I needed, I couldn't have said what I'd planned to do next. He and I were about the same size, and on the afternoon when I dared to secrete myself in the bin and change out of my clothes and into Selden's, all I did was stand there and whisper, "Hello, my name is Selden Wishnow," and feel like a freak. And not just because Selden had become such a freak to me, and I was being him, but because it was clear from all my transgressive sneaking around Newark and culminating in this costume party in the dark cellar that I had become a far bigger freak myself. A freak with a trousseau. The $19.50 left from Alvin's 20 also went into the suitcase under the clothes. I then hurriedly got back into my own clothes, shoved the cardboard suitcase beneath the other luggage, and before the angry ghost of Selden's father could strangle me to death with a hangman's rope, ran for the alleyway and the outdoors. Over the next few days, I was able to forget what I'd hidden and the unspecified purpose it was meant to serve. I could even count this latest little escapade as nothing seriously aberrant and as harmless as following Christians with Earl, until the evening when my mother had to rush downstairs to sit and hold Mrs. Wishnow's hand and make her a cup of tea and put her to bed, so wretched and distraught was Selden's overworked mother because of her son's inexplicably losing his clothes. Selden, meanwhile, was up in our flat, where he'd been sent to do his homework with me. He was plenty distraught himself. "I didn't lose them," he said through his tears. "How could I lose a pair of shoes? How could I lose a pair of pants?" "She'll get over it," I said. "No, not her. She doesn't get over anything. You're going to send us to the poorhouse," she told me. Everything to my mother is the last straw. "Maybe you left them at gym class," I suggested. How could I? How could I get out of gym class without any clothes on? Selden, you had to leave them somewhere. Think. The next morning, before I headed for school and my mother left for work, she suggested my making a gift to Selden of a set of my own clothes to replace his that had disappeared. "There's the shirt that you never wear, the one from Uncle Lenny's, that you say is too green, and the pair of Sandy's corduroy trousers, the brown ones that never fit you right. I'm sure they would fit Selden just fine. Mrs. Wishnow is beside herself, and it would be such a thoughtful gesture on your part," she said. "And underwear? Do you want me to give him my underwear, too? Should I take it off now, Ma?" "That's not necessary," she said, smiling to soothe my irritation. "But the green shirt and the brown corduroys, and maybe one of your old belts that you don't use. It's entirely up to you, but it would mean a lot to Mrs. Wishnow, and to Selden it would mean the world. Selden worships you, you know that." I immediately thought, she knows. She knows what I did. She knows everything. "But I don't want him walking around in my clothes," I said. "I don't want him telling everyone in Kentucky, 'Look at me, I'm wearing Roth's clothes.'" "Why don't you worry about Kentucky when and if we go to Kentucky?" "He'll wear them to school here, Ma." "What is the matter with you?" she replied. "What is going on with you? You're turning into... So are you." And I ran off with my books to school, and when I got home for lunch at noon, I pulled from the bedroom closet the green shirt I hated and the brown corduroy pants that never fit and brought them downstairs to Selden, who was in his kitchen eating the sandwich his mother had left for him and playing chess with himself. "Here," I said, throwing the clothes on the table. "I'm giving you these." And then I told him for all the good it did in rerouting the direction of either of our lives. "Only stop following me around." There were leftover delicatessen sandwiches for our supper when Sandy, Selden, and I got back from the movies. The adults, who'd eaten in the living room when their meeting was through, had by now all left for home except for Mrs. Wishnow, who sat at the kitchen table with her fists clenched, still embattled, still grappling day in and day out with everything determined to crush her and her fatherless son. She listened, along with the three of us, to the Sunday night comedy shows, and while we ate, watched Selden the way an animal watches over her newborn when she's caught a whiff of something stealthily creeping their way. Mrs. Wishnow had washed and dried the dishes and put them away in the pantry cupboard. My mother was in the living room pushing the carpet sweeper over the rug, and my father had collected and put out the garbage and carried the Wishnow set of bridge chairs downstairs to return them to the back of the closet where Mr. Wishnow had killed himself. The reek of tobacco smoke pervaded the house, despite every window having been thrown open, and the ashes and butts flushed down the toilet, and the glass ashtrays rinsed clean and stacked away in the break-front's liquor cabinet, from which not a bottle had been removed that afternoon, nor, in keeping with the matter-of-fact temperance practiced in the bulk of homes of that first industrious American-born generation, a drop requested by a single guest. For the moment, our lives were intact. Our households were in place, and the comfort of habitual rituals was almost powerful enough to preserve a child's peacetime illusion of an eternal, unhounded now. We had the radio going with our favorite programs. We had dripping corned beef sandwiches for supper and rich coffee cake for dessert. We had the resumption of the routines of the school week before us and a double feature under our belts. But because we had no idea what our parents had decided about the future, had as yet no way of telling whether Shepsy Tershwell had persuaded them to immigrate to Canada, whether Cousin Monroe had come through with an affordable legal maneuver to challenge the relocation plan without getting everyone fired, or whether, after poring over the ins and outs of their government-ordained displacement as unemotionally as it was in them to do, they'd found no alternative but to accept that the guarantees of citizenship no longer fully extended to them. The embrace of the totally familiar wasn't the Sunday night debauch it would ordinarily have been. Selden had got mustard all over his face when he hungrily attacked a sandwich, and it surprised me to see his mother reach over to wipe it off with a paper napkin. His letting her do it surprised me even more. I thought, it is because he has no father, and though by now I believed that about everything that concerned him, probably this time I was right. I thought, this is the way it's going to be in Kentucky. The Roth family against the world, and Selden and his mother for dinner forever. Our voice of belligerent protest, Walter Winchell, came on at 9. Everyone had been waiting on successive Sunday evenings for Winchell to lay into Homestead 42, and when he failed to, my father attempted to rid himself of his agitation by sitting down to compose a letter to the one man aside from Roosevelt whom he considered America's last best hope. "This is an experiment, Mr. Winchell. This is the way Hitler did it. The Nazi criminals start with something small, and if they can get away with it," he wrote, "if no one like you raises a cry of alarm." But he never proceeded to list the horrors that could ensue, because my mother was sure that the letter would wind up in the office of the FBI. It is mailed to Walter Winchell, she reasoned, but it never reaches Walter Winchell. At the post office, it's diverted to the FBI and placed in a folder labeled Roth, Herman, to be filed beside the existing folder labeled Roth, Alvin. My father argued, never, not the U.S. mail. But my mother's commonsensical reply stripped him on the spot of what little remained of his certainty. "You're sitting there writing Winchell," she said. "You're predicting to him how these people will stop at nothing once they know what they can get away with. And now you're trying to tell me that they can't do what they want to do to the postal system." Let someone else write to Walter Winchell. Our children have been questioned by the FBI already. The FBI is already watching like a hawk because of what Alvin did. But that, he told her, is why I'm writing him. What else should I do? What more can I do? If you know, advise me. Should I just sit here waiting for the worst to happen? In his helpless bewilderment, she saw her opportunity, and not because she was callous, but because she was desperate, she seized it and thereby humbled him further. You don't see Shepsy sitting around writing letters and waiting for the worst to happen, she said. No, he replied, not Canada again, as though Canada were the name of the disease insidiously debilitating us all. I don't want to hear it. Canada, he told her firmly, is not a solution. It is the only solution, she pleaded. I am not running away, he shouted, startling everyone. This is our country. No, my mother said sadly. Not anymore. It's Lindbergh's, it's the Goyams, it's their country, she said. And her breaking voice and the shocking words and the nightmare immediacy of what was mercilessly real forced my father, in the prime of his manhood, fit, focused, and undiscourageable as any 41-year-old could possibly be, to see himself with mortifying clarity, a devoted father of titanic energy, no more capable of protecting his family from harm than was Mr. Wishnow hanging dead in the closet. To Sandy, still silently enraged by the injustice of having been stripped of his precocious importance, neither of them sounded anything but stupid. And alone with me, he didn't hesitate to speak of them in the language he picked up from Aunt Evelyn. Ghetto Jews, Sandy told me. Frightened, paranoid, ghetto Jews. At home, he sneered at just about everything they said on any subject, and then sneered at me when I appeared to be skeptical of his bitterness. He might anyway have begun by now to seriously enjoy sneering. And perhaps, even in ordinary times, our mother and father might have found themselves having to tolerate, as best they could, a restless adolescent's contemptuous derision. But back in 1942, what made it more than merely exasperating was the ambiguously menacing predicament throughout whose duration he would continue disparaging them right to their faces. What's paranoid? I asked him. Somebody afraid of his shadow. Somebody who thinks the whole world's against them. Somebody who thinks Kentucky is in Germany and that the President of the United States is a stormtrooper. These people, he said, mimicking our captious aunt whenever she would superciliously distinguish herself from the Jewish rabble. You offered to pay their moving expenses. You offered to throw open the gates for their children. Know what paranoid is, Sandy said? Paranoid is nuts. The two of them are bats. They're crazy. And you know what's made them crazy? The answer was Lindbergh, but I didn't dare say it to him. What? I asked. Living like a bunch of greenhorns in a goddamn ghetto. You know what Aunt Evelyn says Rabbi Bengelsdorf calls it? Calls what? The way these people live. He calls it keeping faith with the certainty of Jewish travail. And what's that supposed to mean? I don't understand. Translate, please. What's travail? Travail! Travail is what you Jews call tsuris. The Wishnows had gone back downstairs, and Sandy had settled into the kitchen to finish his homework when my parents, at the front of the house, tuned the living room radio to Walter Winchell. I was in bed with the lights out. I didn't want to hear another panic-stricken word from anyone about Lindbergh, von Ribbentrop, or Danville, Kentucky, and I didn't want to think about my future with Selden. I wanted only to disappear into forgetful sleep and to wake up in the morning somewhere else. But because it was a warm night and the windows were wide open, I couldn't help, at the stroke of 9, but be beset from virtually every quarter by the renowned Winchell radio trademark, the clatter of dots and dashes sounding over the telegraph ticker, and signaling in Morse code, which Sandy had taught me, absolutely nothing. And then, above the ticker's dimming clatter, the red-hot blast of Winchell himself issuing from all the houses on the block. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, followed by the staccato barrage of the long hoped-for words. At last, the purgative Winchell scourge that would change everything. In normal times, when it was generally within the power of my mother and father to set things right and explain away enough of the unknown to make existence appear to be rational, it wasn't at all like this. But because of the maddening here and now, Winchell, even to me, had become an out-and-out god and more important by far than Adonai. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all the ships at sea. Let's go to press. Flash!" To the glee of rat-faced Joe Goebbels and his boss, the Berlin butcher, the targeting of America's Jews by the Lindbergh fascists is officially underway. The phony moniker for Phase 1 of organized Jewish persecution in the land of the free is Homestead 42. Homestead 42 is being aided and abetted by the most respectable of America's robber barons, but don't worry. They'll be rewarded in giveaway tax breaks by Lindbergh's Republican henchmen in the next pro-greed Congress. Item: whether the Homestead 42 Jews end up in concentration camps a la Hitler's Buchenwald has yet to be decided by Lindbergh's top two swastinkers, Vice President Wheeler and Secretary of the Interior Henry Ford. Did I say whether? Pardon my German. I meant when. Item: 225 Jewish families have already been told to vacate the cities of America's Northeast in order to be shipped thousands of miles from family and friends. This first shipment has been kept strategically small in order to escape national attention. Why? Because it marks the beginning of the end for the 4.5 million American citizens of Jewish descent. The Jews will be scattered far and wide to wherever Hitlerite America first is flourish. There the right-wing saboteurs of democracy, the so-called patriots, and the so-called Christians can be turned against these isolated Jewish families overnight. And who's next, Mr. and Mrs. America? Now that the Bill of Rights is no longer the law of the land and the racial haters are running the show, who's next under the Wheeler-Ford pogrom plan for government-funded persecution? The long-suffering Negroes? The hard-working Italians? The last of the Mohegans? Who else among us is no longer welcome in Adolf Lindbergh's Aryan America? Scoop: this reporter has learned that Homestead 42 was in the works on January 20th, 1941, the day the American Fascist New Order moved its mob into the White House and was signed into the Iceland sellout between the American Führer and his Nazi partner in crime. Scoop: this reporter has learned that only in return for the gradual relocation and eventual mass imprisonment of America's Jews by the Lindbergh Aryans would Hitler agree to spare the British Isles from a massive armed invasion across the English Channel. The two beloved Führers agreed in Iceland that massacring blue-eyed, blonde-haired, bona fide Aryans didn't make sense, unless you definitely had to. And it comes as no surprise that Hitler will most definitely have to if Oswald Mosley's British Fascist Party fails to take dictatorial control of 10 Downing Street before 1944. That's when the master race plans to wrap up the Nazi enslavement of 300 million Russians and to raise the swastika over the Moscow Kremlin. And how long will the American people stand for this treachery perpetrated by their elected president? How long will Americans remain asleep while their cherished Constitution is torn to shreds by the fascist fifth column of the Republican right, marching under the sign of the cross and the flag? Stay with me, your New York correspondent, Walter Winchell, for my next big bombshell about Lindbergh's treasonous lies. I'll be back in a flash. With a flash.
This ends Disc 7.